By convention time, the Johnson temper toward and hatred for Jack Kennedy had grown in proportion to Kennedy's startling campaign progress. Kennedy's dislike for him was returned in kind. In reference to his own late announcement, Johnson, in cutting sarcasm towards Kennedy's extended senatorial absences, had explained that he had a post of duty and responsibility in Washington as the majority leader, and unctuously added, "Because of that duty, a duty to all the people, I cannot be absent when there is public business at stake. Someone has to tend the store." From then on, the fighting got dirty. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I am Jess, Connell, and I would love to earn your subscription today. We are, I believe, in part 4 of our walk through what I'm calling JFK Circling the Truth. And we are still in the section where we are setting up a few key players to have a better understanding before we move into the actual events of Dealey Plaza and the assassination of JFK. So last time we took time to read about Lee Oswald's odd behaviors in Japan at Atsugi Air Base. And so if you missed that, you may want to go back to that. I found that it gave a great look at Lee Oswald's personality described by people who were just going through life alongside him without an agenda. People who Epstein had talked with that gave a real look at his character, but also some odd events that happened during his time as a Marine, and particularly involving him. So you may want to go back to listen to that. Today, we are looking at a book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon, a study in illegitimate power. And the reason I even have this book is because people kept telling me, if you really want to understand Lyndon Johnson, if you really want to know what he's like, you've got to read this book. And the whole first part of this book is all about the shady ways, the underhand ways, the manipulative and clearly not legal ways that he won elections and controlled Texas in a lot of regard, and then moved into the Senate with the same heavy-handed control. Well, today we are going to look at not his history, but who Lyndon Johnson was as he entered the vice presidency, and what his attitude toward the presidency was. Because in case you don't know, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, we sometimes call him, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he had run against Kennedy in 1960, and it was a bitter dispute. And if he could piece together enough votes, he still felt like, even when they got all the way to the convention, he still felt like he could maybe piece together the presidency. And so at the convention, when it became clear that JFK was going to win, they, through a backroom communication, offer the vice presidency to LBJ, and he took it, much to the chagrin of his supporters. They did not like Kennedy. They had spent months hating Kennedy. And a modern equivalent would be, oftentimes we notice that if somebody drops out in Super Tuesday, which is like February, March, of the election year, they still kind of have a hard time getting on the stage in July or August at the convention and giving a convention speech in favor of the candidate that they were opposed to. So we're talking about in the same week getting through all those emotions. So you can imagine how difficult that would be. Well, we are going to jump into right before the 1960 election to get a look at LBJ. In April 1959, the left-wing Committee for an Effective Congress attacked Johnson, charging that he, a master of the immediate, was, quote, doomed to failure unless he could yoke his labors to a new national spirit, by which they meant a liberal and integrationist one. Robert McCormick, in his NBC program on January 4th, 1960, let loose a devastating blast, holding that no Texan would ever get the nomination, and touched upon the rawer aspects of Johnson's nature. So this is what we're looking for. What is Johnson's nature? Who is he? What sort of man was he? These are the things that we're paying attention to, and this is why we are reading these books, is to get a look at the character of the man before we move into the actual decisions and machinations that happened once he became president and once he appointed the Warren Commission. We're just looking now to get, who was he? I also want to point out, we're already in the middle of the reading, but this book was published, I believe, in 1964. Yes, it's copyright 1964. So this isn't way in hindsight. This is somebody who is looking at the long history of LBJ and writing this the very next year after the assassination to give people a look at their new president. So here's the rawer aspects of Johnson's nature. His, quote, incredibly bad temper, end quote. His habit of snapping and snarling at his overworked staff. And the fact that after 21 years as an all-out FDR New Dealer, his fiery liberalism had given way to the tactics of a sneak conciliator. At a Democratic fundraising dinner in Washington thereafter, Texas National Committee woman Mrs. R.D. Randolph informed the party leaders that she was not for Johnson for president. Johnson, however, was working feverishly to gain favor with the liberals, especially the radical labor and racial groups. So there had already been bitter division in Texas, in the Texas delegation, between senators and congressmen and various people in various sides who, and you have to understand, as I read through this section to move into what we're about to read, there were segregationists and anti-segregationists. There were liberals and conservatives. There's also various individuals whose corruption LBJ is overlooking. And through these various factions, he is piecing together support and trying to appease whoever he needs to get their support. Now, on the one hand, that sounds like, yeah, it's a politician. Hello. But there was a huge amount of division, and particularly with some of the names that are going to come up. One of them is Ralph Yarborough, who ends up being in the motorcade with JFK and LBJ. Another is John Connelly. So the things that were happening in the Texas delegation and amidst their issues actually are still playing out 3 years later in the motorcade. Again, the Texas liberals and conservatives had been sold out through the master maneuvering, pressure, trading, and deception of Lyndon Baines Johnson through an alliance of leading labor, Mexican, and Negro politicians with the political eunuchs, the pious advocates of moderation, and those big business interests always ready to go along to get along. It left deep and ineradicable scars. It gained Johnson the bitter end opposition of Senator Yarborough, that's Ralph Yarborough, who we were just talking about, and the most ardent of his liberal followers, who went down the line against him in favor of Adlai Stevenson at LA. There were the ultra-liberals in Texas, finally confirmed in their views that Johnson was a traitor to their cause, a ruthless enemy who would double-cross and destroy anybody who opposed his march to power. Even the conservatives, so rarely in agreement, appreciated their point of view. So you have people who are ultra-liberals and conservatives all within the Democratic Party that are all seeing Johnson the same. In this pragmatic age, politics is no longer the means to high national policy predicated on spiritual purpose, but simply the art of the possible. And therein, Texas had the best. Johnson had been named as the Lone Star's favorite son for president. And for the intoxicating moment, that was all the news media mentioned. And what else could really matter? Johnson is reported to have raised $1 million preparatory to his campaign, principally from the conservative oil men of Texas, and was ready to go to LA armed with all his obtrusive vanity and determination to gain the presidency. Betimes, however, he kept venting his vitriolic spleen upon his urbane, sophisticated, and front-running competitor until it would seem that conciliation, compromise, and concord were impossible. So he's got the backing of the Texas oil men. He's got Texas in a complete stir, various factions are with him, various ones are opposed to him, and it's not all a clear like, oh, he was just liberal, so this whole wing of the Democratic Party was for him and this whole wing was opposed. It was very much that he had made enemies on all sides. He's piecing together his support from Texas, and also he's spewing out things against his front-running competitor, which now we get to Kennedy. What could Jack Kennedy, the scion of arrogant and inherited wealth, polished in the best Ivy League tradition, ideologically drifting upon the high and liberal seas, doubly impelled by Irish resentment over ancestral rebuffs and his own ambition for power, well armed with and aware of the prestige of money, and somehow boyishly charming withal, what could he find in common with this hard, practical, cornball extrovert from the poor and uncultured hills of Texas? Those who thought there was no common ground reckoned not with the lust for power over the souls of men, especially among those who had once drunk its strong and heady brew. So it's contending the only thing that those two men had in common was the lust for power over the souls of men. Johnson excoriated Kennedy unmercifully as the convention approached. He had John Connelly circulating among the correspondents of Washington, suggesting that they print a story that Kennedy had bought the West Virginia primary, after which he would present the proof. Naturally, those wily observers suggested the proof in hand, and then they would break the story. So Johnson's people are trying to feed a story and saying, we'll get you proof after. Go ahead and run the story, to try to slam Kennedy with having purchased the West Virginia primary. Johnson's delayed announcement had not helped. For the anti-Southerners, he was still a Southerner, in spite of all he had done to deny it. With the Southerners, he was a copperhead and a traitor. The ultra-liberals of Texas denied him, and his name was still anathema to such radicals as the ADA and the labor leaders in the North and East. His strange combination of Texans ranged from high party faithful to veteran oil figures such as H.L. Hunt and the parvenu tycoon Morris Jaffe, who gathered to beat the drums, carry the money bags, and mingle with such case-hardened New Deal Johnson friends as Oscar Chapman, Dean Acheson, Tommy Corcoran, and Benny Cohen at L.A. By convention time, the Johnson temper toward and hatred for Jack Kennedy had grown in proportion to Kennedy's startling campaign progress. Kennedy's dislike for him was returned in kind. In reference to his own late announcement, Johnson, in cutting sarcasm towards Kennedy's extended senatorial absences, had explained that he had a post of duty and responsibility in Washington as the majority leader, and unctuously added, "Because of that duty, a duty to all the people, I cannot be absent when there is public business at stake. Someone has to tend the store." From then on, the fighting got dirty. In Independence, Missouri, Harry S. Truman tried to slow the Kennedy stampede by charging that the convention was already rigged. When the health issue intruded at the convention, John Connelly, remember, he is the one sitting in front of Kennedy in the motorcade. He also got struck, and he also questioned the magic bullet. But here we find him 3 years before at the Democratic convention for LBJ. So let's listen. John Connelly called a press conference to report that Kennedy was a secret victim of the incurable but controllable Addison's disease, which little brother Robert F. Kennedy branded as malicious and false. Of course, now we know it to be utterly true and far worse than they acknowledged. But John Connelly outing someone else's medical issues is an interesting move. And it's interesting that they were able to be peaceable and pleasant in the car 3 years later after this sort of public and national betrayal of Kennedy. In leaving Washington, Johnson and Rayburn had, in typical power play, simply recessed Congress to put their colleagues on notice after the convention that they would still have to contend with them to get their pet bills and appropriations through. But it did not help. In LA, brother Bobby was already boasting that Senator Kennedy had the nomination in the bag. With Adam Clayton Powell's support already bargained and bought, Johnson, arriving at LA, was goaded by Bobby's charge that Hoffa was in his camp too. Lyndon, as usual, deplored guilt by association and bitingly recalled that the Kennedys had been running against Hoffa for years. Johnson made little actual headway until he baited Jack to appear at the Biltmore Ballroom in a meeting billed as a historic debate between the leading contenders. In bitter and biting sarcasm, he attacked the sweating, trembling Kennedy to his face for his extended absenteeism from Congress, reversed the religious issue against him, charged him with weakness on civil rights, and scorned his immaturity and inexperience generally, to the delight of the room that was packed with Johnson's friends. It was a brutal assault, as revelatory of Johnson's nature as it was of Kennedy's weakness. So he bills this thing as there's going to be this historic debate between the two leading contenders, even though pretty much JFK had the nomination in the bag. What RFK was saying was true. Kennedy had already secured enough votes to win the nomination, or very close to it. Johnson's numbers were much smaller. And if you want an exact run through of that election and that whole process, we went through the 1960 Life magazine about the election. So you can look for that, and that gives a full rundown. But he bills this debate as if like, hey, it's still up in the air, and this is a historic thing, like we're going to debate it out, packs the room with his friends, and then attacks him on these multiple fronts, and it ends up showing Johnson's nature and Kennedy's weakness. Usually by the time you get to a convention, everybody has sort of accepted, okay, that guy's going to be the nomination. And so even if I bitterly opposed him back in March in the primaries, now we're going to save face by coming together as one party and being unified. But here, Johnson's just like, no, we're going to go on the attack. But it was a useless effort. Johnson fought on, hitting Kennedy with everything in the book, bemeaning his inherited wealth while bragging that he had made his own, accusing him of McCarthyism while he, Lyndon, was helping suppress it, and scathingly charging that old Joe Kennedy's opposition to America's involvement in war was because of his sympathy for Hitler and his Nazis. Bitter assault or not, there was no stopping the Kennedy juggernaut, built with magnificent organization, money, discipline, and brains. Harry Truman had been right. The convention was rigged. America had grown so corrupt throughout the years of Democratic and modern Republican rule that the nomination was up for sale, and the Kennedy clan had all it took to buy it. What Johnson lacked was not purpose and design, but money. That's an interesting accusation. I haven't heard that precisely, but I'm sure that it helped. I would love to know the sourcing for that. When, on the night of July 13th, 1960, Kennedy rolled to victory on the first roll call and the convention erupted into turmoil, the Texas delegation sat stunned, still, and grim. So at this time in party conventions, they would do a roll call, which now is done in the conventions, and it's just sort of like a point that you have to get through in the convention of like, we already know which state is going to go for which person, and they yell it out. The delegates from Missouri cast our ballots for Joseph Biden or whatever, and they say it, and that's the end of it. Well, at this time, that was not a given, and states might shift who they were for. And so to win on the first roll call was a big deal, because at this point they might have suspected that LBJ had pieced together enough support to where he could at least make it to where nobody had a clear 50%. And so then it would go to a second roll call. But for Kennedy to be able to lock it in with the first roll call was actually a big deal. So the Texas delegation is stunned. Upon the motion to make his nomination unanimous, only one Texas hand was seen to go up, while the entire delegation held their seats. So one Texas guy is like, I'll go unanimous with the rest of the country. Everybody else is just sitting there. As the ovation ran on, Rayburn and Connelly finally rose, Connelly turning and nodding to the delegates behind him, who grudgingly got up, except for Governor Price Daniel, who angrily kept his place. In speaking to his forlorn followers after the die was cast, some felt that for once, Johnson almost rose to greatness. But the nature of the power-mad politician reasserted itself. Oh, okay, that's over really quick. They didn't even give us a hint of his speech. Apparently, he seemed to be magnanimous for the moment. The power-mad politician reasserted itself, and there are varying versions of what followed. John S. Knight reported, decidedly in line with Johnson's character, that when Bobby Kennedy called, he and Rayburn demanded that Johnson be given second place. Bobby could not believe it. They assured him they were in deadly earnest, and that if it were not peacefully granted, they would take the floor and fight for it. Bobby reported to Jack, who called firsthand, to get the ultimatum. Kennedy demurred, wishing to put it up to leaders of several state delegations. "Tell him," Lyndon added, "that I deserve the vice presidency and intend to get it." Jack carried the news to Mayors Dealey of Chicago and DeSapio of New York and Governor Mike DeSalle of Ohio, who were equally astonished, as Stuart Stymington was their choice. After hours of sober debate, they capitulated and sent word that, after all, LBJ was their man. So John Knight and Sam Rayburn demand that Johnson be given second place, and Bobby couldn't believe it. He goes and reports the ultimatum. Kennedy calls to hear it for himself. Kennedy calls at least three, two mayors and one governor in Chicago, New York, and Ohio, kind of the power stack there. And they're astonished because they had already chosen a guy who they thought would make a great vice president. And then they decide, nope, we'll go ahead with LBJ. The news was hardly a bigger bombshell in the Kennedy than in the Johnson camp. The utter cynicism of the deal left the honest partisans on both sides absolutely dumbfounded, while everybody groped for a reason. Yeah, if you have cultivated your supporters, and you see this a little bit, actually the most recent one that comes to mind for me is the Nikki Haley, Donald Trump moment about a year ago, where Nikki Haley in the spring of 2024 had made her case that she was basically the anti-Trump, that she was, honest, that she was principled, that she kept her word, that she had had lots of government experience, and that basically her case was like, I'll be a steady force. And then you had Trump, and the two sides, he was mocking her and classic Trump tactics. And so the two sides basically loathed one another. And actually, in opposed to what happened in 1960, I'm not even sure that she came, if I remember correctly, to the convention when he finally got the nomination. She did give a message of support, but there was still a bitter rivalry even 3 or 4 months later, even after an assassination attempt on his life. She still wasn't super like, yay, I'm on Team Trump. So that was with 4 months between the two moments, and those two camps didn't just embrace and lock arms and come together for the sake of the party. But this is we're talking about like a 24-hour period where the roll call is held. Kennedy's men come out on top. Johnson's team is like, what just happened? And they're shell-shocked. And then within a matter of hours, the two camps are saying, hey, he's going to be the vice president. And anybody who's an honest partisan, it says, the honest partisans on both sides were absolutely dumbfounded. So Kennedy's people are like, what? LBJ is the absolute worst. He is backwoodsy. He is manipulative. He makes deals with anybody and everybody. He has no principles. And Johnson's men are like, Kennedy's a rich boy. He's, Joe's son. You've been telling us he's basically pro-Nazi. What is wrong with you? How can you link up with this man that you've taught us to hate? Nobody accepted Chester Bowles's superficial explanation that the bitter attack could be explained away in the heat of politics. Neither did the soothing suggestion that Johnson took the place to save the South make sense, especially after he had let Texas and the South go their own way when Adlai Stevenson was running. Their suggestion that he accepted to exercising restraining influence on Kennedy is the most asinine of all. Johnson wanted power. And with all his knowledge of political strategy and his proven control of Congress, he could see wider horizons of power as vice president than as Senate Majority Leader. In effect, by presiding over the Senate, he could now conceive himself as virtually filling both high and important positions. And he was not far from wrong. So if you are not from America, or if you forget from your government and economics class in high school, one of the only actual functions of the vice president is to serve as the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. Congress has an odd number of members, so they can do their own tie-breaking. But the Senate has 100 members, 2 senators for every state. And so there are instances where you get to a 50-50 split. And in those instances is when the vice president gets to exercise an actual power. Otherwise, there's a whole lot of waiting and no official duties on the part of a vice president. But in this instance, the vice president gets the tie-breaking vote. And so he's saying, because LBJ had been this power man in the Senate and had brokered deals, and we read about the whole Bobby Baker scandal and the way that he was using money and business and influence and bills in the Senate to retain his own power and to further the finances of his friends. Because he already had that role, he's asserting, J. Evetts Haley, the author of this, is asserting that actually LBJ could see the vice presidency as just sort of an expanded version of the same role, that he would have tendrils in the executive branch and also be able to retain some level of wheeling and dealing in power in the Senate, which is a really interesting point. As Victor Lasky pointed out, Johnson had nursed a lifetime dream to be president. As majority leader, he never could have made it, but as vice president, fate could always intervene. Along with power, Johnson loves money, and some experienced observers believe that he accepted the nomination for cold cash in hand. Of 2 stories widely bandied about, one from New York is to the effect that Joe Kennedy flew $500,000 overnight to LA to tender and be paid to Lyndon Johnson to take second place, which is entirely apart from the published report that Kennedy reimbursed him for his nomination expenditures, while others wondered what became of the $1 million that Johnson is said to have collected in advance. Whatever the legendary character of this account, the fact remains that some responsible students of Johnson's career are convinced that he accepted second place for money. So, did he do it for the power? Did he do it for the money? We don't exactly know. We are going to skip ahead a few pages. The chapter on the presidential race between the two ends this way. He was now just one heartbeat away from the presidency. That was right where he wanted to be. Well, now we get to the assassination. When on November 22nd, 1963, that ready resort of illegitimacy, the dread act of assassination, struck the moral and healthy world dumb, the vengeful wails of the psychopathic fringe immediately rent the air in hate, while the masses were still prostrate in prayer. Where the truth was not completely obscured, it was assiduously distorted in several important areas. First, President Kennedy, as the television broadcasts amply proved, was not depressed with premonitory doom, but was in high spirits throughout the morning. Second, the city of Dallas, regardless of its just antipathies for the Kennedy program, was gay and generous in its festive welcome. Third, the assassin Oswald was not just an intellectual Marxist, but a calculating, trained criminal agent of international communism. This is interesting. We're going to read more about Oswald, so just hold this, but though the media still insisted on referring to him simply as a Marxist. Fourth, The fact that if the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, instead of attacking the right and pursuing a campaign to play down the dangers of communism, had lived up to his oath of office to enforce the laws of the United States, Oswald would have been registered as an alien criminal, his whereabouts known, and most likely the president's life would have been saved. Of course, at this time, in less than a year after, the truth about Oswald was not known. The truth about where the shots had come from wasn't fully seen and known. Last and most important, Oswald could never be allowed to live long enough to break and talk, or even be brought to trial. If he broke, and there were signs that he was about to, he might reveal his co-conspirators, his friends, and his Confederates. But even if he did not, it would never have done to allow him to be brought to trial, because this would have exposed the degenerate conspiracy that made him a criminal communist. With Oswald on trial, communism would have been on trial, and its evil nature perforce relayed to the far corners of the world by all the news media. This could never be allowed to happen. Instead of Oswald's being tried, decent Dallas and healthy America were indicted generally as criminals, with no less a figure than the Chief Justice of the United States taking the lead in the lynching. So he's saying, instead of letting the truth be known, instead of us all getting to hear from Oswald, who were his co-conspirators, what shadowy figures affected his choices? Which is a good question, even if you think that Oswald was not actually the guilty party. His point is, had Oswald been able to go to trial, we would have all been able to hear whatever led to the assassination. This is good, clear reasoning. And yet he's saying, actually, instead of that happening, decent Dallas was indicted for just being a hateful place, and healthy America was indicted as being completely unhealthy and letting really manipulative, un-American things take root in our hearts, and that those things, hateful Dallas and unhealthy America, were basically pointed to as a place where this sort of hatred could flourish, rather than, hey, let's just get to the bottom of it and find out who actually funded and influenced this terrible action that harmed our nation. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was at the head of this lynching, he calls it. Surely, in such a degenerate perversion of the truth, of decency and justice as this, the government of the United States would step in and see that the truth was brought out and that justice was done. Momentarily, the people hoped and expected that President Johnson, a native Texan of undoubtedly tough mettle, if not of courage, would move at once with every legitimate resource at his command. They expected him to not only dig out and expose the whole truth, but to calm the wave of perverted hate and shame that the communist underworld and their psychopathic allies were so assiduously and effectively cultivating to the criminal injustice of Dallas, of Texas, and America. On the contrary, he moved to do the opposite. It was known in Washington that Oswald was a highly favored communist agent. The fact posed for Johnson a historic opportunity. But instead of laying plans to break off relations with Russia after a reasonable period for quieting of the popular passions, a move of dramatic moral resolution which would have inspired the world, his first reported action upon reaching the White House, probably at McGeorge Bundy's insistence, was to call and reassure Khrushchev of our peaceful intentions. His next call was to perhaps the most sinister labor leader in the world, David Dubinsky of New York City. In each case, the intelligent, inquiring public wonders why. Some have suggested politics. Just a few hours after the assassination? This thought does violence even to the coldly pragmatic nature of Lyndon B. Johnson. Well, I don't think it does. I think that's how he operated. Almost certainly, the reason lay in the very nature of illegitimate power, in fear. I do think this is accurate, actually. I think we read through William Manchester's book, The Death of a President, and in that book, he does indicate that Johnson was unusually quiet for the few hours after the assassination, that he seemed quieted and softer for a moment. Johnson and his fear-stricken colleagues, suspecting a worldwide conspiracy, as voiced by Johnson immediately after the killing in Dallas, wanted reassurance. Instead of acting from courage, Johnson's calls were impelled by fear. Fear of what Russia might think or do. Fear of what might happen to Johnson next, unless the worldwide conspiracy could be reassured. And reassured it was, if not in so many positive words, which seems most likely, then certainly by an all-important official action that followed. For it will be recalled that when Johnson was rushed out of Parkland Hospital at Dallas by Secret Servicemen, friends and Confederates, surrounded and crowded down in the car where he could not be seen, and sped to Love Field to be sworn in as president by the curtained windows of the presidential plane, and hurriedly flown away to Washington, he and his associates were in obvious terror. In rushing away from Parkland, he had expressed concern over a possible worldwide conspiracy, the thought that he might be next, and that those in line of presidential succession, House Speaker McCormick and Senator Hayden, might be marked for assassination too, and anxiously inquired, "Are they prepared to get me out of here?" This was not the reaction of brave men in the face of danger. This was the age-old response of rulers who have come to power through illegitimacy, men gripped with fear, even fear of the people they rule. Nothing whatever was done to keep the city of Dallas and patriotic Americans everywhere from being blamed for intolerance and hate, and from being branded as accessories to the crime of killing Kennedy. The assassination of the president was unspeakably evil, but the horrible perversion of morality and of justice through the mass indictment of millions of Americans was far worse. Did President Johnson rise in righteous concern to rectify this slander of a great people stricken in anguish and in grief? On the contrary, he abetted it. On November 26, 1963, he ordered the FBI to take charge of all evidence pertaining to the assassination, with a promise that its reports would be made public immediately. On the same day, however, the official organ of Moscow in America, the communist paper, The Worker, editorialized on President Kennedy's virtues, laid the blame for his death on the ultra-right, and recommended that the president appoint a special commission, headed by Chief Justice Warren, to investigate it. 3 days later, just as the communists suggested, Johnson appointed such a commission, composed with one exception of ultra-liberals, with the Chief Justice, whose aid to the communist cause is of extensive record in his Supreme Court opinions as chairman. Just 3 days later still, December 2nd, President Johnson rescinded his earlier promise to give America the truth, announcing that the FBI investigations and reports would not be made public, but would be turned over to the Warren Commission for evaluation, a shallow euphemism, but an effective device for suppressing the truth. This was not only in line with the managed news policy of the Kennedy-Johnson administration, but in keeping with the specific suggestions of the communists and implicit in Warren's bias and background. For the Chief Justice, with the prejudicial nature for which he is notorious, had rendered his verdict before any of the evidence was in. In his eulogy before the Kennedy catafalque in the rotunda of the Capitol, Warren assailed the forces of hatred and malevolence, claiming the president was assassinated as a result of the hatred and bitterness that has been injected into the life of our nation by bigots. Thereby, the Chief Justice, positively knowing that Oswald was an avowed and known agent of international communism, proved himself to be the leading advocate of the perversion of truth and justice in America. Obviously, he had been made chairman of the commission to whitewash the communist conspiracy and cover up the truth. Shortly thereafter, Warren confirmed this fact by announcing that much of the evidence might not be released in our lifetime. Thus, the American people are convinced that the truth of the Oswald case and its Jack Rubenstein-Ruby connections will never be known. At least not until they elect a president who believes they have a right to know the truth. Wow. That last section was killer. He really brought it down to the point, which is that this man was not committed to the truth of the assassination. And the Warren Commission didn't get to the bottom of it. The American people did not get the FBI reports. We did not get to the bottom And he says, until we have a president who's willing to tell us the truth, we won't, which is very interesting because it has taken multiple efforts. 1975, 76 was the start of one, 1991, 92 was the start of another, and just recently we've had another wave of documents being released, congressional investigations, and yet still the American people has not been given the truth about the very questions he's posing in 1964. Very fascinating, interesting look at LBJ, the man himself in a quest for power, the man after the assassination in a state of fear, and his unwillingness to keep faith with the American people and tell them the truth as he had promised to do, and instead opting into letting the Chief Justice of the United States take part in a commission that would whitewash the facts. Interesting look. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time we are doing something a little bit crazy, and I hope you guys will stay with me for it. I went to my local library and found this volume and just was struck by it and decided, you know what, this is a happy serendipity for us that I came across the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev. And it's through the years that are precisely what we need. And he has a whole section on JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so next time we are going to read about the Cuban Missile Crisis through the eyes of Nikita Khrushchev, which is a very unusual look that I'm interested in. But more than that, what I'm interested in as we look at this book, and I did read through it last night, so I'm super excited to read it with you guys. But one thing we're going to look at is his perception of JFK. What did the, moral opposition to the United States at this time, what did their leader think and perceive? What are his truthful recollections? Later, he's at the end of his life looking back at these years. What did he say about JFK? So come back for that. I don't think that selection will be as long because I'm not that interested. We'll read a little bit about the details of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a little bit, just to give a sense of his perspective on the matter. But the main thing we're going to be looking for is, what did the great opposition to Kennedy think of JFK? One more thought about that. I had someone in a recent comment be like, everyone tries to look back at Kennedy and make him so important. But actually, if you look at what he did, he really didn't do that much. He wasn't that successful of a president, whatever. That type of argument. And I just don't believe that's true. I didn't live at the time, but anybody looking back can see not just the rhetoric, but the moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis and decisions he was making about war, about finances, about international obligations, all sorts of points where Kennedy was taking the country in a distinct trajectory that 80%, we want to remember, of the people were saying he was doing a good job. And so I want to look back and go, what did his opponent think of him? So we'll do that next time. Come back and we will see you then. Hope you have a great day.